When Karen from the HOA decided to cut off my irrigation system, she thought she was just teaching me a lesson. What she didn't expect was to turn the whole neighborhood into an uncontrolled river. Now, with flooded houses and angry neighbors, she's trying to shift the blame. But the security cameras tell a different story. The first time I heard about her was through a flyer that appeared in my mailbox, a glossy sheet full of ridiculous rules that looked like they had been written by someone who had never set foot in the earth without wearing designer gardening gloves. Rules for a Harmonious Neighborhood, the title read. It had to be a joke. My irrigation system had been installed years ago, perfectly adjusted to keep my lawn and garden alive without wasting water. But apparently, the woman from the HOA, the one with her perfectly coiffed hair and a look of superiority that could kill an ox, thought I was using resources irresponsibly. 3 notices later, I received a letter with a more aggressive tone. Last warning, if the system is not shut down, measures will be taken. And that's when I realized I wasn't dealing with someone normal. This was the kind of person who believes that reigning over a neighborhood is the pinnacle of human power. Someone who has nothing better to do than measure the height of fences and count how many leaves fall in other people's yards. And, worst of all, someone who thinks they know more about hydraulic systems than someone who has actually studied and installed one. The problem? This woman knew absolutely nothing about plumbing. The night it all happened, I was indoors, watching TV, and enjoying the silence of my own property, when I heard a strange sound coming from outside. A dry pop, followed by the sound of water running where it shouldn't be. I went outside to see what was happening, and there, crouching next to my irrigation system, was her, the president of the HOA, with a cheap flashlight stuck to her forehead and a wrench in her hand, twisting a pipe as delicately as someone trying to open a jar of pickles. The horror of incompetence was palpable. She looked at me and widened her eyes, as if I were the criminal there, as if I were the intruder in my own home. "You can't do this," I said. The woman took a deep breath, trying to regain her pose of authority, but it seemed difficult when she was all muddy and with water splashing straight into her face. "You can't waste water. It's against HOA rules." Ah, so that was that. She thought she was doing a good deed, as if I were a cartoon villain, wasting water while laughing evilly. I tried to explain. I told her that the system was regulated to be efficient, that it prevented waste by keeping the irrigation on at strategic times. That I knew what I was doing. But the HOA is never interested in reality. The woman snorted, turned the wrench one last time, and then everything went to hell. A loud pop, followed by the most hysterical scream I've ever heard. The main pipe broke, and with it, all the pressure from a system that had been set up to work perfectly. Water started gushing out as if someone had punctured a fire hydrant, creating a jet high enough to wet the roof. She fell on her butt on the floor, panting, trying to understand what had just happened. But the worst was yet to come, because the irrigation system was linked to something much bigger. Did the HOA want to save water? Well, now they were going to have too much water, and in a matter of minutes, the whole neighborhood was going to feel it. The sound of the gushing water was so loud that you could hear it echoing through the neighborhood. I stood still for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The woman, still lying on the ground, was looking up at the sky as if God was about to give her a personal sermon. But God didn't need to worry. I was going to do it. But before I could say anything, I realized something worse. The water pressure wasn't decreasing. In fact, it was increasing. Because here's the detail that the HOA didn't bother to understand. My irrigation system wasn't just an irrigation system. It was part of the neighborhood's underground drainage network. One wrong adjustment here, and it could turn into total chaos. And that's exactly what happened. Somewhere down there, underneath the well-kept grounds of the HOA's perfectly identical houses, water was building up, putting pressure on the pipes that were installed decades ago, before any of these idiots had the bright idea to create a community aesthetics committee. The woman finally managed to stand up. She was soaking wet, her hair dripping with water, her once perfectly aligned makeup now looking like a tasteless abstract painting. But she still tried to act as if she had control of the situation. This is your fault, I blinked. My fault? Your system. You built it the wrong way. I looked at the chaos going on around me, at the gush of water that was now turning my sidewalk into a private lake, at the current that was beginning to spread across the street, sliding downhill as if it were escaping from a newly burst dam. And then I looked at her, the person who was literally holding a wrench in her hand, stuck in the wreckage of the pipe she herself had broken. "Let me get this straight," I said, crossing my arms. "You invade my property, tamper with something you don't understand, completely destroy the system, and now you want to say it's my fault?" She opened her mouth as if to reply, but was interrupted by a loud pop. And then we heard it. The first bang came from the next-door neighbor's house, the second from the street below. In a matter of seconds, the old pipes in the neighborhood began to explode one by one, like a chain reaction. The groundwater, which had previously been directed correctly by the system I had installed, now had nowhere to go. So it found the easiest way, up through the residents' houses. The sidewalks began to crack. The streets were covered in muddy water. The houses below my property, the ones with the neatly trimmed gardens, the impeccable white fences, the garden decorations that looked like they had been picked out of a magazine catalog, were now slowly being swallowed up by an accidental flood. I heard the first scream from a neighbor and knew the fun was just beginning. The woman's eyes widened, finally realizing that things had gotten completely out of hand. Oh no. "Oh, yes," I replied, pointing to the mess. She stumbled back, pulling out her cell phone as if the HOA had a private emergency service to solve this kind of catastrophe. But what did she think she was going to say? "Hello, committee. Yes, I just turned the neighborhood into a Titanic set. Can you fix it?" The doors of the houses began to open. Residents came out, first confused, then horrified. One couple pointed at the knee-deep water. Another woman shouted that her basement was filling up. And then came the noise I'd been waiting for. The sirens. First the fire department, then the police. In a matter of minutes, the street was full of emergency vehicles, trying to understand how, in a neighborhood where the biggest emergency last month was a fight over the color allowed for garage doors, we now had a real flood. The woman from the HOA was desperately trying to look innocent, but the neighbors wanted answers. And that's when one of them pointed at my security cameras. "Hey, do you have recordings of that?" She turned her face towards me so fast that I thought she was going to dislocate her neck. Now she realized my security system recorded everything, and it was all there, in high definition. The HOA couldn't blame an old pipe. It couldn't make up any excuse. The recording clearly showed the woman breaking into my system, turning the wrench like a lunatic, and then being bathed in her own incompetence. I cracked a smile. "But of course I do." The silence that followed was beautiful. The woman swallowed. The neighbors began to murmur. One of the policemen looked at her and then at me. "Can we see that recording?" The woman tried to intervene. She tried to say that it was all a big misunderstanding, but no one else was listening. She had done exactly what she wanted to do. She had changed the whole neighborhood, just not in the way she had planned. And now she was going to pay for it. The recording was watched by the policeman right there in front of everyone. A bunch of soaked neighbors huddled around the cell phone, while sirens blared in the background and firefighters tried to deal with what was now officially a disaster caused by sheer stupidity. The video showed everything. The woman invading my property, opening my irrigation system with the delicacy of a drunken gorilla, turning the wrench with no idea what she was doing, and finally being knocked down by her own failure when the water exploded right in her face. It was a work of art. The silence that followed was filled with pure, absolute guilt. She looked around, her eyes darting from one neighbor to another, as if trying to find someone who was still on her side. No one was. one of the most affected neighbors, a man I only knew by sight, the guy who always walked past mowing the lawn with military precision, crossed his arms and said, "So, you did it." The woman, who until 5 minutes ago walked around with the posture of a queen dictating laws, suddenly looked like a child caught stealing candy before dinner. It wasn't like that, but nobody wanted to hear it. "My garage is full of water," shouted another neighbor. "My basement, too. Who's going to pay for that?" And it was at that very moment that things really started to fall apart for her. Because, until then, this woman had lived in a world where she dictated the rules, where the HOA could levy absurd fines, create ridiculous regulations, and make everyone toe the line just because they had signed a contract the moment they bought their homes. But the HOA is not the government. It's not the police. It has no power when the shit hits the fan. And now that the houses were flooding, the fire department was involved, and a dozen residents wanted her head on a platter, she realized that there was no more regulation that could save her. The policeman finally put his cell phone back in his pocket and looked at her. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us for clarification." It was then that desperation struck. She began to speak rapidly, the words stumbling over each other. "This is a misunderstanding. It was an accident. I was just following HOA rules." But that's when someone, one of the neighbors who hated her as much as I did, probably, unleashed the sentence that sealed her fate. "Do you really think the HOA has the power to control the city's water supply?" The woman froze. The realization hit her. Because, yes, she had spent years terrorizing residents, handing out ridiculous fines, and forcing everyone to follow senseless rules. But now, she had caused a real disaster, and no one, absolutely no one, was going to pretend that it wasn't her fault. The policeman gestured to the patrol car. "Please, ma'am." She looked around, hoping that someone would say something on her behalf. Nothing. No neighbors. No HOA members. Not even the perfect husband who always showed up with her at meetings to agree with everything that came out of her mouth. Alone. Finally realizing that she had dug her own grave. So, with no choice, no allies, no authority whatsoever, she walked to the police car. And when the car door closed, the whole neighborhood erupted in murmurs and disguised smiles. But me? I wasn't finished yet. Because the HOA, as a whole, was going to pay for it too. The firefighters spent the next 6 hours draining the water from the streets, basements, and garages. The neighborhood had never seen so much chaos. People ran around trying to save boxes, carpets, and furniture. Some neighbors were trying to unclog drains and gutters, while others were simply pissed off, watching what were once well-kept backyards now turned into muddy swamps. And, in the middle of it all, Mr. the only one who wasn't affected at all. Fate has a perfect sense of humor. Because the woman wanted to teach me a lesson. She wanted me to stop wasting water. And now half the houses in the HOA were flooded, while mine remained exactly as it was. And you know what? She hadn't even paid the beginning of the price. As soon as the firemen finished stabilizing the situation, I went straight to the lawyer. Not just any lawyer, one of those sharks, a guy who lives to crush arrogant people who think they know everything. So what did we do? We sued the HOA for trespassing, for property damage, for criminal destruction. And, just to make sure the case stayed interesting, we sued the woman herself individually, so that she would also pay out of her own pocket for what she had done. And it wasn't just me. The neighbors, furious at the damage, began to join me. In a matter of 3 days, 20 families filed lawsuits against the HOA and against her. And then, the bombshell came. The HOA didn't have enough money to cover everything. They were using residence fees to pay for everything. But as we found out later, a lot of that money was disappearing. And where was it going? To her. That's how it all blew up for good. The police opened an investigation into the HOA. They discovered financial fraud. And in less than a month, the association was dissolved. It was over. No ridiculous regulations. No absurd fines. No woman with a clipboard telling me what can and can't be done on my property. What about her? Well, she lost her house. There were so many lawsuits against her that she was forced to sell everything to pay the damages. And the icing on the cake? When the new owners moved in, guess what was the first thing they did? They installed a brand new irrigation system. Because well-used water has never been the problem. It was always the problem. The destruction of the HOA was swift, quick, and beautiful to watch. It didn't take long for the lawyers to move in like a pack of wolves sniffing for blood. The association's money disappeared faster than dignity at a condo meeting. The fund that was supposed to cover community improvements was drained by lawsuits, compensation, and court costs. And the woman? Well, she went down with it. The court didn't even need long to decide. With the recordings, the testimonies, and the flood of lawsuits coming in from all sides, the judge took one look at the case and practically threw her into the fire without needing a match. She was held directly responsible for the damage caused by the flood and had to pay such a large amount of compensation that, honestly, I felt a little sorry for her. Just kidding. Not sorry at all. She tried to appeal, of course. She tried to say that she was just applying the HOA rules, that she didn't know this would happen, that it was an accident. But then the neighborhood lawyer, an old guy who must have been tired of dealing with these kinds of people, calmly stood up and said, "Ma'am, what part of 'don't touch what you don't understand' didn't you understand?" And with that, it was over. The sentence came, and, along with it, the final destruction of the woman's comfortable life. The HOA was officially dissolved. That means all that ridiculous regulatory crap has gone to waste. Goodbye, fines for planting the wrong color flowers. Goodbye, warnings for misaligned fences. Goodbye, authoritarian control from a woman who thought she was mayor of a neighborhood that nobody asked for. And the woman? She lost everything. Her husband dumped her before the trial was even over. She sold the house before the bank took it. She disappeared without a trace. And what about me? I did exactly what any sensible person would do. I bought her land. Yes, I bought the house she was so protective of. Not that I wanted to live in it. Of course not. I just wanted the satisfaction of knowing that that space would never again be controlled by an HOA or any other clipboard despot. And what did I do with the land? I turned it into a beautiful, vast community garden. The neighbors loved it. Now, where once stood the house of a woman who ruled with an iron fist, there is a place where people can grow whatever they want, without anyone trying to shove ridiculous rules down their throats. And the best part? I've installed a new irrigation system. More modern, more powerful, more efficient. And just in case, I put a big sign on the side. Warning, if you don't understand hydraulics, don't touch what isn't yours. And so the HOA died, and my water kept flowing, exactly as it should be. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel.